So you figured out that the pacing for your story needs some help. Now what? Well, that's what I'm going to go over in this video, so stay tuned.
When you know I'm bad at being alone.
Hi guys, welcome to the third and final part of my pacing series. I'm going to give you some tips on how to fix your pacing. First thing, learn your genre. If you're not familiar with the pacing expectations, read some top-rated books from your genre, top-rated novels from your genre. When I wrote Pride Be Damned, that's the type of book I naturally gravitate towards when I'm reading. So when I was writing it, the pacing came a bit more naturally to me. A bit. I still had to work at it. I still had editing to do and all that, but it wasn't as much editing because I naturally wrote in more abrupt ways. I didn't put in a lot of flowery description. The more of that genre that you read, the more naturally that pacing will come to you. The rhythmic beats of the pacing will become ingrained into your writing. Like I said in part 2, an outline will give you a bird's eye view. So you'll be able to see where your pacing needs work. It's actually going to be easier if you've already written your story because you can just jot down scenes, maybe highlight or put a highlight sticker next to it. This is a fast-paced scene, this is a slow-paced scene, and just see how it measures out against the genre of your choice. If you're writing a genre that's supposed to have a higher ratio of slower-paced scenes, and you look at that list and see that it's mostly faster-paced scenes, then you know you need to work on either the pacing or change the genre. Another way to keep your action scenes going at a fast pace is to avoid lengthy descriptions. However, character, setting, even props need description even in action scenes. Whether it's a fast pace or a slow pace, your scene needs to either A, reveal something about the character, or B, push the plot forward. I have an example for you that I just wrote off the cuff. It's not perfect or anything like that, but it's just an example of how you can weave those things into an action scene without forcing your reader to slam on the brakes. The leather seats were hot against her back, the steering wheel burned its shape into her palms. As if superstitiously believing her only hope at surviving this crazy, terror-filled night could disappear from view at any moment, she placed the .45 Magnum on her lap, taking a sad kind of comfort in the weight of it against her leg. So, you know that she's driving a car with a leather interior. You know it's hot, so it's probably summer. She's also not wearing a thick coat, so that's also indicative of warmer months. She's scared. She's got a gun. I mean, we all know guns are heavy, but it just gives that extra tactile description to the reader. She's probably not used to having a gun because she takes a sad kind of comfort in the weight of it against her leg. So she's probably not used to using guns. She's scared that she's not going to survive. And she's maybe a little bit superstitious, but you know, who wouldn't be at a time like that? That's just an example of weaving description into your action. So instead of having a separate paragraph about the leather interior or about how she's never used a gun before or about the heat. I mean, you can have that stuff in slower paced scenes. You could have her reacting to the heat or her fear of guns or whatever the case might be. You can have that in other scenes. Just make sure that the intricate detail that you give, that there's a reason for it and that you give that reason later on. And don't be afraid to cut from one scene to the next, even if it's just a paragraph. If it fits, think of your favorite action movie, where it'll have the protagonist, and then it'll have the bad guy, and then it'll have the protagonist and the bad guy, and it's just cutting scene to scene. Don't be afraid to do that. If it works for the scene sequence, do it. And even if it doesn't, you'll find out later. Just do what comes naturally first, and then worry about the rest in the editing. Info dumps are a bad thing, regardless of the pacing of your book. Do not throw a whole bunch of information at your reader all at the same time. Intersperse it throughout the story as it's needed. K.M. Weiland put it perfectly in one of her books. Think about when you first meet somebody. Do you want to know everything about that person right away? Or do you just want to know, little bits and pieces here and there? That the journey of that relationship, finding things out as you get to know somebody, is part of the fun, right? It's part of the excitement. That's what you want people to do, is get to know your characters, not just find out everything all at once. Because really, if they find out everything all at once about your character right in the beginning, why do they need to keep reading? Shorter chapters and shorter scenes equal a faster pace. If you want a slower pace, concentrate more on character development in some areas, or concentrate a bit more on setting. For examples, I was going to read from popular books, but to give an accurate example of pacing, it's a bit of a gray area as to whether or not I would be infringing on copyright laws. So that's why I'm going to read from my own books instead. Not because I think they're filled with perfect prose that everyone can learn from. They're not perfect. But you can learn from my mistakes. But I don't want to risk copyright infringement. So I'm going to read some scenes from my own books, and actually one book, Good Samaritan. The slower paced scene takes place a week after Toby has moved in with his Aunt Amy, Uncle Clayton, and his 13-year-old cousin Asher. It starts off mid-scene. Toby has just gotten out of bed, didn't get a whole lot of sleep because of incessant nightmares, got ready for school, and now all he wants is a cup of coffee. You'd think that would be an easy task, right? Cup of coffee, no big deal. Not so much. That had been no more than 15 minutes ago. So needless to say, Toby was pretty confident he could live on coffee alone at that point. His stomach chose that moment to grumble and protest, apparently not at all happy with the idea of a liquid diet. Okay, food would be awesome too, he told himself, even as a sudden yawn nearly cracked his jaw in two. But first things first, coffee. This would be his first cup since he'd begun this little adventure of living with practical strangers, treading lightly over new house rules and regulations with the full knowledge he really had nowhere else to go. 8 o'clock curfew? Fine. In bed by 9:30? Fine. Whatever. Homework finished before supper, no snacks or television after 8:30? Doable. But not allowing him to have any coffee? Even first thing in the morning? Seriously? Toby had done his best to abide by all his aunt's ridiculous and unyielding statutes. Really, he had. But it had been a rough night. So yeah, this morning, all bets were off when it came to caffeine consumption. Which was why, when he stepped into the kitchen, he made a beeline for the coffee pot. His mouth watered in anticipation. Amy stood at the stove, tending to the bacon, eggs, and hash browns, each in its own fry pan. Toby felt her eyes on him, watching every move he made. Nothing new there. It had become commonplace, really, but he was honestly too tired to care just then because all he could think about was the rich, dark brew sitting tantalizingly within arm's reach. Thankfully, he didn't need to waste precious moments searching through the cupboards for a coffee cup, because a mug tree stood conveniently next to the coffee maker. Ingenious decor choice, in Toby's humble opinion. He gently but purposefully lifted a mug from one of the wooden pegs and filled it with steaming hot liquid from the coffee pot. No coffee for anyone under the age of 21 in this household, Amy reminded him curtly from behind. Sorry, long night, he muttered by way of explanation as he turned around and raised the mug to his lips. Making eye contact with her, it took a moment for the hard, forbidding gaze to register. He weighed his options. Risk falling asleep in class, and worse, jolting awake from a repeat of last night's nightmare, this time with witnesses, or deal with the consequences of defying his aunt. It was really a no-brainer. Neither of them broke eye contact, fighting a battle of wills right there in the kitchen. Maybe he should give this some more thought. This was her house after all, and he'd have to be a fool to have not figured out by now his aunt was accustomed to having her rules obeyed without question. Now for a bit of a faster pace. This is a fight scene from Good Samaritan, where Toby is suffering the consequences of earlier actions in school. where he was defending Asher. And then they were on top of them. Toby saw one goon land a solid punch to Asher's jaw, and the kid's head whipped back with the force of it. Protective instincts soaring, Toby kicked Jimmy in his already injured knee, taking satisfaction in the cry of pain. Next, he brought his knee up to one guy's groin, then turned to the guy who'd punched Asher, giving him a taste of his own medicine as he brought his knuckles up to slam into the guy's nose. The bone crunching beneath his fist made his stomach turn, but there was no time for regret as the fourth guy descended on him. Toby landed on his back. He struggled beneath the huge weight on his chest. He couldn't get free. Asher was back on his feet, but instead of running, he threw himself on the back of Toby's opponent, wrapping his arms firmly around the thick neck and shoulders. A second later, Asher was flung through the air. He landed on the ground with a dull thud, a distinct contrast to the sharp but truncated cry that escaped at the point of impact. Toby glanced to the side. The kid wasn't moving. Reaching blindly for something to use as a weapon, Toby flashed back to... Instead, he closed his fist around some clumps of dirt. He wasn't able to get much because the ground is still mostly frozen from the cold winter months, but he got what he needed and threw it up into his opponent's face. The guy screamed as a majority of the dirt landed in his eyes, and he fell back off Toby's chest, fingers instantly scratching at his face as he tried to remove the dirt. Toby sucked in as much oxygen as he could, even as he crab-walked over to his cousin, silently praying the kid was okay. Asher was sitting up with a groan as he reached him, earning a sigh of relief from Toby. He glanced at all four boys who were beginning to recover from their injuries. Not surprising, really. Toby had merely been trying to buy some time to get Asher to safety. He just hadn't counted on that one guy getting the drop on him. He also hadn't figured on his cousin jumping on the dude's back. Regardless, there was no time for Asher to get to the tree line, and there was no way Toby could hold them all off simultaneously to increase that window of opportunity. His gaze fell on the boxcar. Okay, back to plan A. Or was it plan B? Pulling Asher to his feet, wishing he had time to be more careful when the soft grunt of pain reached his ears, Toby hauled his cousin over the few feet to the weed-covered railroad and boosted him up into the boxcar. He pulled the doors closed as fast as he could, needing to put all his strength into it as he fought against the year's worth of rusted metal, not to mention the weeds which had taken up residence after soil had been blown inside the boxcar. Asher had recovered enough to realize what Toby was doing and lunged for the doors to try to stop him. The doors clanged shut, almost drowning out the kid's holler of, "Toby, don't!" Toby didn't have time to yell back any kind of reassurance as he felt one beefy fist grab him by the arm and another grip the back of his jeans. A second later, he was jerked away from the car and flying through the air. He landed on his back on the cold, solidly packed earth, and his breath rocketed out of him. He tried desperately to bring more in to replace it, but hadn't even fully caught his breath yet from his last encounter with Gigantor. Panic took hold for a brief second, then he was finally able to pull in some precious oxygen. But before he could fully appreciate that achievement, his assailants had descended on him again, simultaneously. They punched and kicked and punched some more. As predicted, it hurt. A lot. That's my version of a faster pace. My books aren't super action. The genre is more drama, action, suspense. The slower paced scene was more character development, setting the scene, introducing all of the main characters that are going to be in the book, and then the fight scene was... It was still a bit of character development. It was relationship development between Asher and Toby, where they proved to each other that they were there for each other. Think of the last time you told a friend something that you were excited about. Did you tell them in, like, well drawn out sentences that were perfectly grammatically correct? Probably not. You need to do your writing like that as well. Choose wisely when you can maybe lax a bit in the pronouns and the perfectly structured sentences. So one final tip. After you read from the genre, after you find out the rules for the genre, you get a feel for the pacing, find some music that matches it. Find a movie that has that kind of pacing, like Jurassic Park, Star Wars, E.T. They all have such great soundtracks by John Williams, again. But then there's The Sting, and the score for that was by Marvin Hamlisch and Scott Joplin. The Sting had an excellent score. So did Jaws, Indiana Jones. I could go on and on. In fact, I did find a website in my research for this, and I'll link it below. It's the 50 best film scores of all time. I love so many of those scores. When you're listening to music that matches the pacing, try to pick music without lyrics. That's why I recommend the scores, because they don't have lyrics to them. Because if you pick songs with lyrics, then you might end up like me and by accident typing the lyrics instead of your story. Just a little tip there. It all boils down to this. Study the rules for the genre you choose, or genres, depending on if you have more than one. And those rules will tell you what pacing your reader is expecting for that genre. In some ways, writing is subjective. In other ways, it's not. The rules for the genre are not subjective. You have to abide by those rules, but they leave lots of room for creativity. It's just reader expectation matters. But we're also constantly discovering new things about our craft. So if you make a mistake with the genre or the audience or anything else, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. I made mistakes with Pride Be Damned. I learned from them, and I didn't make those same mistakes with Good Samaritan. Then I made other mistakes with Good Samaritan, and I'm going to make sure not to make those mistakes with Book 3. You learn from your mistakes. That's the important thing. Learn from your mistakes. Instead of beating yourself up over them, learn from them, and apply those lessons to the next book. And remember, no one is ever going to write the perfect story. There's always going to be readers that hate it. The key is getting at least one person to love your story. And if you do that, then you're a success. Plain and simple. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe below, and don't forget to click that bell so that you'll get notified when I upload new videos. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a great day, and stay happy, healthy, and safe. Bye-bye.